Welcome to Stoic Vivu, where ancient wisdom meets modern life challenges. I'm here to help you discover how timeless Stoic philosophy can transform your everyday struggles into opportunities for growth and strength. Our mission is simple: to make the profound teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus accessible and practical for anyone navigating the complexities of contemporary life. Today, we're diving into a question that affects millions of generous-hearted people. How do you maintain your natural kindness without losing yourself in the process? You've probably experienced this dilemma firsthand. You give freely, help willingly, and put others' needs before your own, only to find yourself feeling drained, unappreciated, or even taken advantage of. Sound familiar? Here's what the ancient Stoics understood that we often forget. True kindness requires wisdom, and genuine generosity demands boundaries. When Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations nearly 2,000 years ago, he grappled with these same challenges of leadership, relationships, and personal integrity. Seneca counseled friends about the delicate balance between helping others and maintaining self-respect. Epictetus taught that we must master ourselves before we can truly serve others. The transformation we're exploring today isn't about becoming selfish or closing your heart to others. Instead, it's about developing what the Stoics called practical wisdom, the ability to give from a place of strength rather than depletion, to help others without sacrificing your own well-being, and to maintain boundaries that actually make your kindness more powerful and sustainable. Throughout this journey, you'll discover 7 essential insights that will revolutionize how you approach relationships, generosity, and personal boundaries. You'll learn to recognize the warning signs that indicate when your giving has become unbalanced, understand why certain people seem drawn to exploit your kindness, and master the ancient practices that protect your energy while amplifying your positive impact on others. Most importantly, you'll gain access to the same wisdom that helped Roman emperors, philosophers, and countless individuals throughout history maintain their integrity while navigating complex social dynamics. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts. They're practical tools that you can implement immediately in your daily life, whether you're dealing with demanding colleagues, overwhelming family expectations, or friends who seem to take more than they give. The Stoics believed that every challenge contains the seeds of wisdom and growth. Your struggle with boundaries isn't a weakness to overcome. It's an opportunity to develop the kind of balanced strength that creates lasting positive change in both your life and the lives of those around you. By the end of our time together, you'll have a clear roadmap for transforming your natural kindness into a source of personal power and authentic connection. 1. How to set healthy expectations that actually protect your heart. You're sitting at your desk on a Friday afternoon, having just finished covering extra shifts for a colleague who claimed they had a family emergency. For the 3rd time this month, as you pack up to leave, you notice they're posting vacation photos on social media from what appears to be a spontaneous weekend getaway. Your chest tightens with that familiar mixture of anger and disappointment. How did you become the person everyone calls when they need someone to pick up their slack? This scenario illustrates one of the most painful patterns that generous people fall into: creating expectations for reciprocity that others never agreed to meet. When Epictetus taught his students about the dichotomy of control, he emphasized that we suffer most when we expect others to behave according to our standards rather than their own. He understood that our expectations, when misplaced, become the source of our greatest emotional turmoil. Consider this: every time you give freely, your mind naturally creates an unspoken contract. You invest your time, energy, or resources with the unconscious belief that others will operate by the same principles of fairness and reciprocity that guide your actions. The Stoics recognized this tendency as fundamentally flawed thinking. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that we must adapt ourselves to the life we've been given, but love the people with whom we share it. Notice he didn't say, expect them to love us back in the same way. The ancient philosophers understood something crucial about human nature that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. People respond to consistent patterns, not individual acts of kindness. When you regularly solve problems for others, they begin to see you as a problem solver rather than a person with your own needs and limitations. This isn't malicious behavior on their part. It's simply how human psychology works. Seneca addressed this dynamic in his letters to Lucilius, explaining that true friendship requires what he called mutual benefit without obligation. He distinguished between relationships built on genuine connection and those based on utility. When you give with hidden expectations, you transform yourself from a friend into a service provider. The other person may genuinely appreciate your help, but they're responding to the role you've created for yourself, not necessarily to you as a complete human being. Imagine you're planning a dinner party and spend days preparing elaborate dishes, decorating your home, and creating the perfect atmosphere. You envision grateful guests, meaningful conversations, and perhaps offers to help with cleanup. Instead, people arrive late, spend the evening on their phones, leave early, and assume you'll handle everything. Your disappointment isn't really about the dinner. It's about the gap between your expectations and reality. The Stoic approach to this situation involves what Epictetus called prosoke, continuous attention to your own thoughts and motivations. Before you give, examine why you're giving. Are you hoping to create debt? Are you seeking validation? Are you trying to prove your worth? Or are you genuinely moved by compassion and the simple desire to help? Marcus Aurelius practiced a form of morning reflection where he would remind himself that some people he encountered that day would be ungrateful, selfish, or difficult. This wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. By acknowledging human nature honestly, he protected himself from the emotional volatility that comes from unrealistic expectations. He could then choose to help others from a place of strength rather than need. The practical application of this wisdom requires developing what the Stoics called preferred indifference. Outcomes we might prefer, but don't depend on for our happiness. You can prefer that people reciprocate your kindness, express gratitude, or remember your generosity. But your emotional equilibrium cannot depend on these preferences being fulfilled. Here's a powerful exercise drawn from classical Stoic practice. Before offering help to anyone, take 60 seconds to visualize them accepting your assistance without thanking you, using your help to benefit themselves exclusively, and never offering anything in return. If you can still give freely and genuinely in that scenario, your generosity comes from virtue rather than expectation. If the visualization creates resentment, pause and examine your true motivations. This doesn't mean becoming cynical or withholding help. Rather, it means giving from abundance rather than deficit. When you give because you value generosity as a character trait, rather than because you expect specific responses, your kindness becomes unconditional and therefore genuinely powerful. The Stoics taught that expectations directed toward others are a form of attachment that inevitably leads to suffering. Epictetus regularly reminded his students that other people's actions belong to them, not to us. Your colleague's decision to take advantage of your flexibility is their choice and reflects their character, not yours. Your response to their behavior is where your power lies. You might wonder how this philosophy applies when you're facing genuine unfairness or when people consistently fail to meet basic social obligations. The Stoic response isn't passive acceptance. It's strategic disengagement from emotional investment in outcomes beyond your control. When Marcus Aurelius dealt with senators who disappointed him or citizens who seemed ungrateful, he didn't stop fulfilling his duties as emperor. Instead, he fulfilled them because they aligned with his values, not because he expected specific responses. This distinction becomes clearer when you consider the difference between conditional and unconditional giving. Conditional giving says, "I'll help you because I expect you to help me later." Unconditional giving says, "I'll help you because helping aligns with who I choose to be." The first approach makes your emotional well-being dependent on other people's choices. The second approach places your emotional well-being entirely within your own control. Seneca illustrated this principle through his own experience with friends who borrowed money and never repaid it. Rather than becoming bitter or stopping all financial assistance, he simply changed his internal framework. He began treating loans as gifts in his own mind. If friends repaid him, he viewed it as a pleasant surprise. If they didn't, he had already mentally released the expectation. This mental shift eliminated the resentment that would have otherwise poisoned those relationships. Ultimately, setting healthy expectations means redirecting your focus from what others should do to what you choose to do. The ancient wisdom teaches us that protecting your heart doesn't require building walls around it. It requires understanding that your heart's well-being depends on your choices, not on other people's responses to those choices. This understanding transforms disappointment into detachment and resentment into freedom. 2. Why people take you for granted and how to change that today. You walk into the office break room Monday morning to find your favorite mug sitting in the sink, unwashed with coffee stains around the rim. This is the same mug you lent to a coworker 3 weeks ago when they complained about the broken handle on theirs. You've mentioned it twice since then, but somehow it never makes its way back to your desk. As you stand there washing someone else's mess from your own property, a familiar question echoes in your mind. When did helping others become a one-way street? This everyday scenario reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology that Marcus Aurelius understood when he governed the Roman Empire. People adapt to whatever patterns you establish with them. The emperor wrote in his meditations about the importance of maintaining dignity in all relationships, noting that when we consistently act without requiring reciprocal respect, we inadvertently teach others that respect is optional in their interactions with us. The psychology behind being taken for granted operates on what the Stoics called habituation, the human tendency to normalize whatever becomes routine. When you consistently solve problems, offer assistance, or accommodate others without establishing clear boundaries, you create what modern behavioral psychology recognizes as an intermittent reinforcement schedule. Essentially, you train people to see your availability and helpfulness as a given rather than a gift. Consider how this pattern typically develops in your relationships. Initially, when you help someone, they express genuine gratitude and perhaps even surprise at your generosity. Your assistance feels special to both of you. However, as your helping becomes predictable, their emotional response diminishes. This isn't necessarily callousness on their part. It's simply how human brains process repeated experiences. What once felt extraordinary gradually becomes expected. Seneca addressed this dynamic in his letters about friendship and obligation, explaining that true relationships require what he termed mutual responsibility. He observed that when one person consistently gives while the other consistently receives, the relationship becomes imbalanced and ultimately unsustainable. The giver grows resentful while the receiver grows entitled, creating a toxic cycle that destroys the very connection the giver was trying to strengthen. Imagine you're the person in your friend group who always organizes gatherings, remembers birthdays, and checks in when others are struggling. Initially, friends appreciate your thoughtfulness and reciprocate when they can. But over time, something shifts. They stop initiating plans because they know you will. They forget your birthday because they've come to rely on you to remember theirs. They share their problems with you but forget to ask how you're doing because you've trained them to see you as the supporter, not someone who might need support. The Stoic approach to changing this dynamic begins with understanding what Epictetus called the discipline of desire, the practice of examining what we truly want from our interactions with others. Often, people who get taken for granted are unconsciously using their helpfulness to meet their own emotional needs for validation, belonging, or purpose. When you give primarily to feel needed or valued, you create relationships based on utility rather than genuine connection. Marcus Aurelius practiced a daily exercise of examining his motivations for helping others, asking himself whether his assistance came from virtue or from hidden emotional needs. This self-examination revealed that true service flows from strength and abundance, while needy helping flows from deficit and insecurity. People intuitively sense this difference and respond accordingly. Here's the crucial insight that transforms everything. Respect is not something others choose to give you. It's something you require through your own behavior. When you consistently accept poor treatment, you're not being kind, you're being complicit in your own devaluation. The Stoics understood that self-respect is the foundation of all other relationships. Epictetus taught that we must treat ourselves with the same dignity we would demand others show to someone we love. The practical transformation begins with what Seneca called measured generosity, giving that comes with clear boundaries and expectations. This doesn't mean keeping score or demanding immediate reciprocity. Instead, it means establishing patterns that naturally encourage mutual respect. When someone borrows something, you kindly but firmly establish when you need it returned. When you help with a project, you clarify what assistance you can provide and what they need to handle themselves. This approach requires developing what the Stoics called courageous virtue, the willingness to risk temporary disapproval in service of long-term respect. Many people avoid setting boundaries because they fear others will think they're selfish or difficult. However, the ancient philosophers understood that people actually respect those who respect themselves. Clear boundaries create safety and predictability that make relationships more comfortable for everyone involved. Consider implementing what Marcus Aurelius practiced in his imperial court, the principle of earned access. The emperor made his time and resources available to those who demonstrated reciprocal consideration and respect. He didn't help everyone equally. He invested more deeply in relationships that honored the mutual dignity he valued. This wasn't favoritism. It was wisdom. The transformation from being taken for granted to being genuinely respected happens gradually but inevitably when you consistently model the treatment you expect to receive. You stop washing other people's dishes left in the sink and instead politely ask them to handle their own cleanup. You stop covering for colleagues who consistently fail to meet their responsibilities and instead allow natural consequences to teach them accountability. Ultimately, changing how others treat you requires changing how you treat yourself. The ancient wisdom teaches us that we cannot expect others to value what we ourselves undervalue. When you demonstrate through your actions that your time, energy, and resources have worth, others naturally adjust their behavior to match your new standards. This shift creates space for authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided service, transforming both your connections with others and your relationship with yourself. 3. The 5-minute daily practice that puts your goals first. You're sitting in your car after another 12-hour workday, staring at the gym membership card in your wallet that you haven't used in 3 months. Your phone buzzes with yet another request from a friend who needs help moving this weekend. The same weekend you had blocked off to finally work on that business plan you've been postponing for 6 months. As you feel that familiar knot of frustration in your stomach, you realize that somewhere along the way, your own dreams became the last item on everyone's priority list, including your own. This pattern reveals what Seneca identified as one of the most dangerous forms of self-neglect: the gradual abandonment of personal purpose in favor of immediate demands from others. In his letters to Lucilius, he wrote extensively about the necessity of protecting what he called the time for the self, daily periods dedicated exclusively to personal growth, reflection, and progress toward meaningful goals. Seneca understood that without this protected time, even the most well-intentioned people become reactive rather than purposeful in their lives. The ancient Stoics developed a specific practice to address this challenge, which modern practitioners can implement in just 5 minutes each morning. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this approach in his own Meditations, where he began each day by writing brief reflections that clarified his priorities and intentions. This wasn't merely journaling. It was a systematic method for ensuring that his deepest values guided his daily choices rather than being overwhelmed by the urgency of immediate demands. The practice begins with what Epictetus called the discipline of assent, the careful examination of what deserves your attention and energy each day. You start by asking yourself 3 fundamental questions that the Stoics considered essential for purposeful living. What am I trying to build or create in my life? What specific action can I take today to move closer to that goal? What am I willing to say no to in order to protect this priority? Consider how this might transform your typical morning routine. Instead of immediately checking messages, emails, or social media, all external demands on your attention, you spend 5 minutes connecting with your internal compass. You might write, "I'm building a consulting business that allows me financial independence and creative fulfillment. Today, I will spend 1 hour researching potential clients and refining my service offerings. I will decline any non-essential social obligations this week to protect this time." This brief morning practice creates what Marcus Aurelius called the fortress of the mind, a clear sense of direction that helps you navigate the inevitable requests, interruptions, and distractions that fill most people's days. When someone asks for your time or energy, you have an immediate reference point for evaluating whether their request aligns with your deeper purposes or simply represents another detour from your chosen path. Seneca emphasized that this practice must be protected with the same vigilance you would use to guard your most valuable possessions. He observed that people will readily defend their physical property from theft, but often freely surrender their time and attention to anyone who asks. The 5-minute morning practice serves as a daily reminder that your time is your most precious resource and your goals deserve the same protection you would give to your financial assets. The structure of this practice follows a specific pattern that the Stoics found most effective for maintaining focus throughout the day. You begin by acknowledging one long-term goal that truly matters to you, something that would create genuine satisfaction and meaning if achieved. This goal should be significant enough to require sustained effort over months or years, not something you could accomplish in a few days or weeks. Next, you identify one specific, concrete action you can take today that moves you closer to this goal. This action should be small enough to be definitely achievable within your current circumstances, but meaningful enough to represent real progress. The Stoics understood that consistent small actions compound over time to create dramatic transformations, while vague intentions without specific behaviors rarely produce lasting change. Finally, you anticipate and plan for the resistance you'll encounter, both internal resistance from your own habits and external resistance from others who benefit from your current patterns. Marcus Aurelius regularly reminded himself that obstacles would arise and that his character would be revealed by how he responded to these challenges. By mentally preparing for difficulties during your morning practice, you strengthen your resolve to protect your priorities when pressures mount throughout the day. The transformative power of this practice lies not in its complexity but in its consistency. When you begin each day by consciously choosing your priorities rather than passively accepting whatever demands present themselves, you gradually shift from a reactive to a proactive relationship with your life. You stop being someone who helps everyone else achieve their goals while your own dreams remain perpetually postponed. This approach also reveals something profound about the relationship between self-care and service to others. When you consistently honor your own goals and aspirations, you model for others what it looks like to live with intention and purpose. You become someone who helps from choice rather than compulsion, and your assistance becomes more valuable because it comes from a person who clearly values their own time and energy. Ultimately, this 5-minute practice transforms your entire relationship with time and priority. Instead of feeling perpetually behind or overwhelmed by others' needs, you develop what the Stoics called the sovereignty of the self, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're actively building the life you truly want while still maintaining your capacity for genuine generosity toward others. 4. How to command respect through ancient boundary wisdom. You're in the middle of presenting your quarterly report when a colleague interrupts for the 3rd time, dismissing your data with a casual wave of their hand. That's interesting, but what we really need to focus on is they begin completely derailing your carefully prepared presentation. You feel your face flush as other team members shift uncomfortably, but you smile politely and let them continue. Later, you overhear the same colleague describing someone else as really sharp and someone you don't mess with. The contrast stings because you realize that respect isn't something you've been receiving lately. It's something you've been unconsciously teaching people not to give you. This workplace scenario illustrates what Epictetus identified as one of the most fundamental principles of human interaction. People treat us exactly as we teach them to treat us through our responses to their behavior. In his discourses, he emphasized that dignity and respect aren't gifts that others bestow upon us. They're natural consequences of how we consistently present ourselves and respond to attempts at poor treatment. The ancient Stoics understood that respect flows toward those who demonstrate self-respect through their actions, not their words. The concept of boundaries, while modern in terminology, reflects ancient wisdom that the Stoics called the proper sphere of choice. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about maintaining what belonged to him, his thoughts, values, and responses, while allowing others to own what belonged to them. This wasn't selfishness. It was a recognition that clear ownership of responsibilities creates the foundation for all healthy relationships, whether personal or professional. Consider how this principle operates in your daily interactions. When someone consistently interrupts you during conversations, your response teaches them whether this behavior is acceptable. If you pause, wait for them to finish, and then continue speaking as if nothing happened, you're inadvertently communicating that your thoughts and words don't require the same respect that theirs do. Conversely, when you politely but firmly say, "I'd like to finish my thought, and then I'm interested in hearing your perspective," you establish that mutual respect is a requirement for continued interaction. The Stoics understood that commanding respect requires what they called virtuous assertiveness, the willingness to stand firm on principles while maintaining kindness and rationality. This differs significantly from aggression, which seeks to dominate others, or passive acceptance, which allows others to dominate you. Virtuous assertiveness seeks mutual dignity and clear communication as the foundation for all interactions. Seneca demonstrated this principle in his relationships with emperors, fellow senators, and household servants alike. His letters reveal that he maintained the same core standards for respectful interaction regardless of someone's social position or power over him. He understood that respect operates according to universal principles of human dignity rather than hierarchical structures of authority or influence. The practical application of boundary wisdom begins with understanding what the Stoics called the discipline of action, the practice of responding to situations based on your values rather than your immediate emotions or the other person's expectations. When someone makes an unreasonable request, treats you dismissively, or violates an agreement you've made, your response should reflect your commitment to mutual respect rather than your desire to avoid conflict or maintain false harmony. Here's where many people misunderstand the nature of boundaries. They assume that setting boundaries means becoming harsh, cold, or confrontational. The Stoic approach reveals the opposite. Clear boundaries actually make relationships warmer and more genuine because they eliminate the resentment and confusion that arise from unclear expectations. When you consistently communicate your limits kindly but firmly, others know exactly how to interact with you successfully. Marcus Aurelius practiced what he called the imperial presence, a way of carrying himself that communicated dignity and self-respect without arrogance or hostility. This presence wasn't about intimidating others. It was about embodying the qualities he wanted to see reflected back to him. Modern research in social psychology confirms what the Stoics understood intuitively. People unconsciously mirror the energy and expectations that we consistently project. The transformation from being overlooked to being respected requires developing what Epictetus called the consistency of character. This means responding to similar situations in similar ways, regardless of who's involved or what mood you're in. If you establish that interrupting you isn't acceptable when done by subordinates, you must maintain that same standard when dealing with supervisors, family members, or friends. Inconsistency in boundaries creates confusion and teaches others that your limits are negotiable rather than firm. Consider implementing what the Stoics called the pause of wisdom, a brief moment between someone's behavior and your response where you consciously choose how to react based on your values. When faced with disrespectful treatment, instead of immediately accommodating or becoming defensive, you pause and ask yourself, What response would a person who respects themselves give in this situation? This simple practice gradually trains you to respond from strength rather than reactivity. The ancient philosophers also understood that commanding respect requires what they termed the courage of consistency. Many people set boundaries initially but abandon them when faced with pushback, guilt, or social pressure. The Stoics recognized that others will often test new boundaries to see if they're genuine or merely temporary expressions of frustration. Your willingness to maintain your standards during these tests determines whether your boundaries become respected limits or dismissed suggestions. Ultimately, the ancient boundary wisdom teaches us that respect isn't something we demand from others. It's something we embody so consistently that others naturally offer it. When you treat yourself with the dignity you want to receive, communicate your limits with clarity and kindness, and maintain these standards regardless of external pressure, you create what Marcus Aurelius called the unassailable fortress of character, a presence that naturally commands the respect you deserve. 5. Build a circle of givers instead of takers with this strategy. You're scrolling through your contacts list, trying to find someone to celebrate your recent promotion with, when a sobering realization hits you. Most of the people in your phone only reach out when they need something. Sarah calls when she needs a ride to the airport. Mike texts when he wants help moving furniture. Jennifer reaches out when she's having relationship drama and needs someone to listen for hours. But when was the last time any of them contacted you just to see how you were doing or to share good news? As you sit there with your phone in hand, you realize that somewhere along the way, you've built a network of takers rather than a community of genuine friends. This pattern reflects what Marcus Aurelius observed about the law of attraction in relationships. We draw people who match the energy we consistently project. In his meditations, he noted that those who approach relationships from scarcity and neediness tend to attract others who operate from the same mindset, creating cycles of mutual depletion rather than mutual enrichment. The emperor understood that building meaningful connections requires first becoming the type of person that other generous, positive people want to be around. The ancient Stoics identified what they called the principle of virtue magnetism, the idea that our character traits act like invisible forces that attract similar qualities in others while repelling incompatible energies. When you consistently give from a place of depletion, anxiety, or the need for validation, you unconsciously signal to potential friends that your relationships operate on a deficit model. This attracts people who are comfortable with unbalanced exchanges because they've learned to take more than they give. Consider how this dynamic typically unfolds in your social life. You meet someone new and, wanting to be liked and valued, you immediately begin offering help, making yourself available and going out of your way to be useful. Your generosity comes from a genuine desire to connect, but it's mixed with an underlying anxiety about whether you're interesting or valuable enough on your own. This anxiety, though subtle, creates an energy that draws people who are looking for someone to solve their problems rather than someone to build mutual friendship with. Seneca addressed this phenomenon in his letters about choosing companions wisely, explaining that relationships based on utility rather than virtue inevitably become transactional and ultimately disappointing. He distinguished between friends who appreciate your character and those who simply appreciate your usefulness. The philosopher observed that those who seek you out primarily for what you can do for them will abandon the relationship when your circumstances change or when they find someone more useful. The transformation begins with understanding what the Stoics called the discipline of character development, the practice of becoming so secure in your own worth that your relationships flow from abundance rather than need. This means developing interests, skills, and sources of fulfillment that don't depend on other people's approval or participation. When you have a rich inner life and a clear sense of purpose, your interactions with others become offerings rather than additions. Imagine shifting your approach to new relationships from, "How can I be helpful to this person?" to, "Is this someone whose character and values I genuinely admire?" This subtle change in focus attracts people who are drawn to who you are rather than what you can provide. It also helps you recognize quickly whether someone is interested in building a mutual connection or simply adding you to their list of available resources. The practical strategy involves what Marcus Aurelius called reciprocal virtue assessment, the practice of observing how potential friends treat others, handle responsibilities, and respond to both good fortune and challenges. The Stoics understood that character reveals itself through consistent patterns of behavior, not through grand gestures or impressive moments. Someone who is chronically late, frequently cancels plans, or speaks negatively about mutual friends is showing you how they'll eventually treat you, regardless of how charming they might be initially. This assessment process requires developing what Epictetus taught as the patience of wisdom, the willingness to let relationships develop gradually rather than rushing into deep connections with people whose character you haven't had time to observe thoroughly. Many people who struggle with taker relationships make the mistake of becoming vulnerable too quickly with new acquaintances, sharing personal information and offering significant help before establishing whether the other person operates with similar values of reciprocity and respect. The ancient philosophers also emphasized what they called the courage of selectivity, the willingness to have fewer relationships rather than accepting poor quality connections. This doesn't mean becoming antisocial or judgmental. It means recognizing that your time and emotional energy are precious resources that deserve to be invested in people who value and reciprocate what you offer. Quality relationships require quality people, and quality people are attracted to those who demonstrate self-respect through their choices. Here's a transformative practice drawn from Stoic relationship wisdom. Before offering help or making yourself available to someone, pause and ask yourself whether this person has demonstrated care for your well-being in the past. If someone only contacts you when they need something but never checks in during your difficult times or celebrates your successes, they're revealing their true priorities. Your continued availability to such people teaches them that one-sided relationships are acceptable and prevents you from creating space for more balanced connections. The strategy also involves what Seneca called modeling mutual generosity, consistently demonstrating the type of friendship you want to receive. This means reaching out to check on others without needing anything, remembering important events in their lives, offering support during their challenges, and celebrating their victories. When you consistently embody genuine friendship, you naturally attract others who operate with similar values while creating an environment where takers feel uncomfortable and gradually distance themselves. Ultimately, building a circle of givers requires becoming a giver who gives from strength rather than need, wisdom rather than anxiety, and genuine care rather than hidden agenda. This transformation attracts people who match your elevated approach to relationships while naturally filtering out those who seek to exploit rather than appreciate your generous spirit. 6. The warning signs that save you from emotional burnout. You're standing in your kitchen at midnight, eating ice cream straight from the container while scrolling through your phone, when you suddenly realize you've been doing this every night for the past 2 weeks. During the day, you feel constantly overwhelmed by everyone else's problems and requests. But instead of addressing the source of your stress, you find yourself seeking comfort in habits that leave you feeling worse. The wine with dinner has become 2 glasses, then 3. The occasional online shopping has turned into daily browsing sessions that drain your bank account. You tell yourself these are just temporary coping mechanisms, but a quiet voice in the back of your mind wonders if you're developing patterns that could become much bigger problems. This scenario illustrates what Seneca identified as one of the most dangerous consequences of emotional depletion: the gradual drift toward destructive behaviors that promise immediate relief but create long-term suffering. In his letters about self-discipline and moderation, he observed that people who consistently give beyond their emotional capacity often seek restoration through activities that provide instant gratification but ultimately compound their problems. The ancient philosopher understood that emotional burnout doesn't just affect our relationships with others. It fundamentally changes our relationship with ourselves. The Stoics developed a sophisticated understanding of what modern psychology calls emotional regulation, though they approached it through the lens of virtue and character development rather than clinical terminology. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively in his Meditations about the importance of recognizing early warning signs that indicate when his mental and emotional resources were becoming depleted. He understood that prevention was far more effective than recovery when it came to maintaining psychological equilibrium. The first warning sign that the Stoics identified involves what Epictetus called the loss of rational discourse with oneself, the gradual abandonment of self-reflection and conscious decision-making in favor of reactive, impulsive behaviors. When you're emotionally depleted from constantly managing other people's needs, your brain begins seeking the quickest available sources of dopamine and serotonin. This biological response is completely normal, but it becomes dangerous when you stop consciously choosing your responses and start operating on autopilot. Consider how this manifests in your daily life. You might find yourself reaching for your phone dozens of times per day, scrolling mindlessly through social media even when you're not genuinely interested in what you're seeing. You might notice that you're ordering takeout more frequently, not because you're particularly hungry for restaurant food, but because the act of ordering provides a small burst of pleasure and anticipation. These behaviors aren't inherently problematic, but when they become unconscious responses to emotional stress, they signal that your coping mechanisms are shifting from healthy to potentially harmful. The second warning sign involves what Marcus Aurelius described as the erosion of boundaries with pleasure, the gradual increase in activities that provide immediate gratification without corresponding attention to their long-term consequences. The emperor observed that people under emotional stress often begin making exceptions to their normal standards, telling themselves that their current circumstances justify temporary indulgences that gradually become permanent habits. This pattern typically begins innocently enough. You might have one extra glass of wine after a particularly stressful day of dealing with demanding colleagues or family members. The wine provides genuine relief from the tension you've been carrying, so your brain naturally associates alcohol with stress relief. Over time, 1 glass becomes 2, then 3, and eventually you find yourself drinking not just after stressful days, but in anticipation of stress or simply out of habit. The same progression can occur with spending, eating, gambling, or any activity that triggers your brain's reward systems. Seneca wrote about his own struggles with what he called the seduction of immediate pleasure, noting that even wise people can gradually develop dependencies when they're not paying careful attention to their motivations and patterns. The third warning sign that the Stoics emphasized involves what they called the abandonment of future-oriented thinking, the gradual shift from making decisions based on long-term values and goals to making decisions based on immediate emotional needs. When you're emotionally exhausted from constantly giving to others, your brain's capacity for complex decision-making becomes compromised, leading you to prioritize short-term relief over long-term well-being. This manifests as making choices that your clear-thinking self would question. You might skip workouts that you know make you feel better because you're too tired to exercise. You might avoid difficult conversations that would improve your relationships because you don't have the energy for emotional complexity. You might postpone important personal projects because focusing on other people's problems feels easier than confronting your own challenges. The Stoic approach to preventing emotional burnout involves what Marcus Aurelius called the daily examination of capacity, a brief but consistent practice of assessing your emotional resources and adjusting your commitments accordingly. This means developing the self-awareness to recognize when you're approaching your limits and the courage to protect your well-being before destructive patterns take hold. The practical application of this wisdom requires developing what Seneca termed the discipline of moderation, the ability to maintain balance even when external pressures encourage excess. This involves creating specific, non-negotiable practices that protect your emotional equilibrium. Regular sleep schedules, consistent exercise, meaningful social connections, and periods of solitude for reflection and restoration. Ultimately, recognizing these warning signs transforms your relationship with stress and giving. Instead of waiting until you're completely depleted and turning to harmful coping mechanisms, you learn to adjust your boundaries and commitments at the first signs of emotional strain, maintaining your capacity to help others while protecting your own long-term well-being. 7. Turn any doubt into lasting trust using Stoic character. You're at a neighborhood barbecue when someone you've just met pulls you aside and whispers, "I don't trust people who are too nice." What's your angle? You're stunned because you were simply offering to help set up tables and asking if anyone needed anything. As you walk away feeling confused and hurt, you realize this isn't the first time someone has questioned your motives for being helpful. A coworker once joked that you must be up to something when you brought homemade cookies to the office. A friend suggested you were trying too hard when you organized a surprise birthday party for someone in your group. The pattern is becoming clear. Your genuine kindness is making people suspicious rather than grateful, and you're starting to wonder if being a good person is somehow working against you. This experience reflects what Epictetus identified as one of the most challenging aspects of living virtuously in a world where many people operate from self-interest. Your authentic goodness can initially trigger suspicion in those who have learned to expect hidden agendas behind every act of kindness. The philosopher understood that this reaction reveals more about others' experiences with inauthentic people than it does about your character. But he also recognized that virtuous individuals must develop strategies for building trust gradually rather than expecting immediate acceptance. The ancient Stoics observed that suspicion toward excessive kindness often stems from what they called the projection of personal experience, people's tendency to assume others operate according to the same motivations that drive their own behavior. If someone has frequently encountered people who use generosity as manipulation, charm as exploitation, or helpfulness as a pathway to personal gain, they naturally develop protective skepticism toward anyone who appears too good to be true. This isn't personal prejudice against you. It's learned caution based on previous painful experiences. Marcus Aurelius addressed this dynamic in his Meditations when he wrote about maintaining virtue even when others questioned his motivations for just governance. The emperor understood that consistent character over time was the only reliable method for overcoming initial suspicion. He noted that people who have been disappointed by false promises and manipulative behavior need to witness authentic virtue repeatedly before they can trust it completely. The transformation from suspicion to trust requires understanding what the Stoics called the patience of character demonstration. The willingness to prove your authenticity through consistent actions over extended periods, rather than expecting immediate recognition of your good intentions. This process cannot be rushed or forced because trust develops according to the observer's timeline, not the giver's desires for acceptance. Consider how this principle operates in practical relationship building. When you meet someone new and immediately offer significant help, share personal information, or display intense enthusiasm for their well-being, you might inadvertently trigger their psychological defense mechanisms. People who have been manipulated by charming individuals often recognize this pattern and instinctively withdraw from relationships that seem to progress too quickly or intensely. The Stoic approach involves what Seneca called gradual virtue revelation, allowing your character to emerge naturally through small, consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures that might overwhelm others' capacity to trust. This means offering modest help before offering major assistance, sharing appropriate personal details rather than intimate secrets, and demonstrating reliability in small matters before taking on significant responsibilities in someone's life. The key insight here lies in understanding the difference between authentic virtue and performance virtue. Authentic virtue maintains its quality regardless of whether anyone is watching or appreciating it. Performance virtue, by contrast, requires an audience and often intensifies when observers are present. People intuitively sense this difference, even when they cannot articulate it explicitly. Someone who helps others because it aligns with their core values projects a different energy than someone who helps because they need to be seen as helpful. Epictetus taught that authentic virtue has what he termed the quality of sustainability. It can be maintained consistently over long periods without requiring external validation or emotional reward. This sustainability itself becomes evidence of authenticity because manipulative people typically cannot maintain false personas indefinitely. Their true motivations eventually surface through inconsistencies in behavior, especially when they encounter stress, disappointment, or situations where their hidden agendas conflict with the generous image they've been projecting. The practical application of this wisdom involves developing what Marcus Aurelius called the confidence of steady character. The inner security that comes from knowing your actions flow from genuine virtue rather than hidden needs. When you help others because generosity aligns with your values rather than because you need their approval or gratitude, you naturally project an energy that feels safe and trustworthy to others. This confidence manifests in subtle but powerful ways that skeptical people learn to recognize and appreciate. You become comfortable with others saying no to your offers of help because your self-worth doesn't depend on being needed. You can accept criticism or feedback without becoming defensive because your actions stem from internal standards rather than external validation. You maintain consistent kindness even with people who cannot reciprocate because your generosity flows from abundance rather than expectation. The ancient philosophers also understood that building trust requires what they called the wisdom of appropriate boundaries, the ability to offer help in ways that respect others' autonomy and dignity rather than creating dependence or obligation. People become suspicious of those who seem to need others to need them, but they trust those who clearly respect their independence and self-sufficiency. Consider developing what Seneca practiced as the transparency of intention, being willing to acknowledge openly when you're still learning, when you make mistakes, or when you're uncertain about something. This vulnerability paradoxically increases trust because it demonstrates that you're not trying to maintain a perfect image. People who have been deceived by those claiming perfection find genuine authenticity refreshing and reassuring. Ultimately, turning doubt into trust through Stoic character requires embracing what Seneca called the long view of virtue, the understanding that authentic goodness creates its own evidence over time. Your consistent kindness without agenda, reliability without neediness, and generosity without strings attached gradually overcome even the most skeptical observer's defenses, creating relationships built on genuine trust rather than temporary charm. And now is your new path forward. Ancient wisdom for modern balance. You stand at a crossroads that countless generous souls have faced throughout history. The choice between continuing patterns that drain your spirit or embracing ancient wisdom that transforms your kindness into sustainable strength. The 7 insights we've explored today aren't merely philosophical concepts. They're practical tools that Marcus Aurelius used to govern an empire, Seneca employed to navigate political intrigue, and Epictetus applied to transform his own life from slavery to philosophical mastery. Think back to that version of yourself who felt constantly overwhelmed by others' demands, perpetually disappointed by unreciprocated generosity, and increasingly resentful despite your good intentions. That person wasn't weak or foolish. They simply lacked the ancient roadmap for balanced giving that you now possess. The Stoics understood that transformation happens not through dramatic personality changes, but through consistent application of timeless principles to daily situations. Your journey forward begins with a fundamental shift in perspective that the ancient philosophers considered revolutionary. Recognizing that your worth doesn't depend on how much others need you, but on how consistently you honor your own values while serving something greater than yourself. This understanding liberates you from the exhausting cycle of seeking validation through usefulness and allows your generosity to flow from genuine abundance rather than hidden deficit. Consider how different your relationships will become when you approach them with the wisdom you've gained today. You'll set expectations that protect your heart while honoring others' autonomy. You'll attract people who appreciate your character rather than exploit your availability. You'll maintain boundaries that command respect while demonstrating authentic strength. Most importantly, you'll give from a place of choice rather than compulsion, making your kindness more valuable to both yourself and those you serve. The ancient Stoics knew that implementing new patterns requires both courage and patience. There will be moments when old habits call to you, when people resist your healthier boundaries, or when you question whether protecting your own well-being is somehow selfish. In these moments, remember that you're not becoming less generous, you're becoming more skillfully generous, offering help that truly serves rather than enabling dependency. The practical exercises we've discussed, the morning priority practice, the expectation examination, the boundary consistency, the character demonstration, these become the foundation for a life where your natural kindness enhances rather than depletes your personal strength. Each day you apply these principles, you move closer to the balanced generosity that the Stoics modeled for us across centuries. Your transformation impacts far beyond your own life. When you demonstrate how to give from strength rather than weakness, maintain boundaries with kindness rather than hostility, and protect your goals while serving others, you become a living example of what healthy generosity looks like. Others will notice this change and perhaps begin their own journey toward balanced giving. If this video has opened new pathways in your thinking about kindness and strength, I encourage you to like it and share it with someone who might benefit from these ancient insights. Subscribe to Stoic Vivu for more practical wisdom that helps you navigate modern challenges with timeless principles. Your journey toward balanced generosity starts now, and the ancient philosophers are cheering you forward.